So Cymene Howe is professor of anthropology at Rice University, and she's also the founding co-director of the Science and Technology Studies program at Rice University. Her interdisciplinary work exemplifies the best of STI scholarship, at least in the mind of many of our colleagues, attending carefully to the material infrastructures while remaining attuned to power relations, social inequalities, and political economies that these technologies both enable and obscure. Her contributions to the environmental humanities are equally remarkable and internationally recognized. Together with her long-term collaborator, Professor Dominique Boyer, Cymene has shaped the emerging field of energy humanities, an interdisciplinary space that brings humanistic and social scientific methods to bear on questions of energy, transition, climate change, and the possibility of environmental futures, if there is going to be any future at all. So it's really work that shows us how to, we can try to imagine how to entertain more caring relations with more than human worlds. Across this field, she's known for pushing the boundaries of research, experimenting with methodologies, as well as engaging and communicating findings to very diverse publics. Cymene's scholarship is distinguished by multi-sited ethnographic approaches to climate and energy that span multiple continents, from the wind parks of Oaxaca, Mexico, to the melting glaciers of Iceland. This work is presented in her award-winning book, Ecologics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, published by Duke University Press in 2019, where she takes us to Mexico's isthmus of Tehuantepec,
Perfect.
home to one of the world's most intensive wind energy developments, and where she examines the paradoxes of energy transitions, asking questions that are critical about environmental justice, indigenous land rights, and who ultimately benefits when renewable energy is scaled up as a climate solution. Cymene is also internationally recognized for her work on glacial loss in Iceland, and I think we're going to hear a lot of that today. In 2019, she and her collaborators organized a memorial ceremony for, this I'm not going to say, Okyokul, known as the OK Glacier.
Yes.
The first Icelandic glacier to lose its official glacier status due to climate change. They installed a plaque bearing a letter to the future, with reads in part, OK is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. Maybe we will hear more about this today on the side. This project, along with the documentary film Not OK, which she co-directed, brought global media attention to the visceral material losses of climate change to these creative practices. I must note that you and Dominic are probably the only that I know anthropologists in my generation who have an article in Science. So you have a published article in the journal Science, which is like a rare occurrence.
It was a surprise to us too, but a nice one.
And I want to just finally mention that beyond traditional academic outputs, Professor Howe is a pioneer in multimedia anthropology, or something that we can call like that. I would say that if she and Dominic wanted, you would have a fantastic career as stand-up anthropologist or something like that, because your public, the things, the podcasts are so funny and so engaging. Really, they are fantastic. So this is something I experienced myself as having the privilege of participating to one of your podcasts of the Cultures of Energy podcast series, which has around 200 episodes on the website.
We just did 250 yesterday.
Oh, you're still doing it?
Yes.
I didn't even know. Well, that's for any person interested in STS or super broadly understood. It's absolutely fabulous, and I recommend it also in terms of, there's a book that came out. You don't have the time to read it, listen to the interview with the author that they give you, because it's always very insightful. Anyway, so I'm going to stop because I should be clear by now who I want to be in my next life. But I'm going to stop and let you speak, and please welcome, join me in welcoming Professor Cymene Howe.
Thank you, Maria. That was an amazing introduction. And I want to be this stand-up anthropologist. Don't tell Dominic that idea. He'll quit his job and that'll be it. Thank you so much for that. That was a fantastic introduction, really warm and heartfelt. And I want to say thank you to Sadie too, who got us all set up here and organized. And also to Robert for our communication and getting here today. It's a super honor to be here in the History of Consciousness program. I did my first 2 years of undergraduate training at UCSC, where I was a feminist studies major. And I missed out on a class with Donna Haraway. So that's the next thing I need to do in my next life, is do that. But I did take a class with Jim Clifford, which I remember sort of little remnants of. That was amazing. I think in those days I was having to do a lot of sort of distribution and requirements in those first couple of years of being here. But it's amazing to be back on the campus too. It's so beautiful. And I'm really happy to be here with you all. This discussion is a work in progress. I want to put that out here right away. And what I'm hoping to get from this conversation personally today is feedback from you, direction from you, criticism, insights, anything you'd like to share. I'd love to hear it because it really is a work in process. And so I'm excited about hearing that. I also want to take a moment to recognize the disturbing state of the world that we're living in right now. I don't want to downplay that particular condition that we're living in, with these kind of questionable futures, which weirdly enough, in a kind of uncanny way, connect to elemental forms. If we think about this war of choice that this country has now gotten into, there are many dynamics that actually feed into these questions about elemental forms. So, if that kind of sparks any interest in this discussion too, I'd be happy to sort of think through these eerie resonances that we see in the unfolding politics of the moment. But first, I wanted to take a moment to be here. And that is to kind of spend a moment and see the water here at work, and also to see the ice here at work, to get a sense of the fire that is beneath this very frozen landscape. This is the view from the top of Oak Mountain, where Oak Glacier, where the glacier used to reside. This is in Iceland. This is a place where I've been doing research for many, many years now. And I wanted to take this time here with Earth and to recognize that its spin, this rotation that we're living upon all the time, is in fact changing night to day and day to night. And so I want to invite you here to take a deep breath and kind of take in the cold air here, to fill your lungs and to stop and to kind of feel the weather in this place. So the elements I'm going to propose are all around us all of the time. The elements compose us from beginning to end. Elements are the matter of the universe, like carbon and hydrogen and calcium and oxygen. But elements are also our context. They are the dispositions of earth and air and water and fire and weather. I would say that they condition our every breath and our every step at every moment. So given all that they are and all that they do and all that they make possible, I'm asking what might unfold if we were to position the elements very centrally as a kind of attentional guide and an analytic invitation to uncover the dynamics that fascinate us, that disturb us, that make us curious. So what if we were to position the elements really centrally in this analytic way, in a theoretical set of attentions and concepts? So in this discussion, I want to start with a very big proposition and then come to a more focused, kind of analytic and also methodological place in this discussion. So first, I'd like to ask how we can observe these human and non-human encounters, both through and with the elements, and how this might help us to surface what I think of as these punctuations. These punctuations are kind of moments of surprise that are super exciting for anthropologists, an event which affect us all, but also the cadences, these kind of patterns and rhythms that we recognize in our world in a quotidian way and that affect all of our time together. I also want to consider the analytic possibilities that are afforded through this engagement with elemental forms. And finally, to offer some very preliminary methodological approaches to evaluate socio-environmental phenomena through these elemental attentions. So in Reactivating the Elements, which came out in a book that came out in 2021, the authors describe that the elements oscillate between substance and semiosis, figure and ground, episteme and cosmology, shaping how and what we come to know. So this medial position between materiality and semiotic inflection speaks to the coordinates of attentional qualities, that which is empirical and can be seen and felt, as well as that which seeks philosophical exploration. Ryan Jobson offers a handful of elemental prompts for my discipline, anthropology, and its method of ethnography in his essay that's called Facing the Flames. He writes, as a discipline forged by fusion rather than fission, the contours of our practice must locate the new boundary spaces that are cast open between disciplines that are set adrift in the present. So Jobson here, by engaging the language of physics, but without also losing sight of the poetics of language, I think he offers us openings into both practice and concept. That is, how do our intellectual projects get reshaped when elemental forms become an entry point into these boundary spaces, what Jobson thinks of as these boundary spaces? Yeah, forward. So, where can the elements take us? I'm asking if we're willing to be delivered, and what might they show us about our own ontological limits or the edges of our epistemic curves? What kinds of narratives might elements tell of themselves, about themselves, if they were given authorial license, if elements could actually write themselves into being? So, for example, what is the document that carbon writes across a century? And how does the half-life of uranium teach us something about living in the present and into an unknown future? What is the anecdote that air might tell from a place where the oxygen is scarce for the people who breathe there? And what sorts of moments would Earth utter as important in the clearing after the fire or after the bombs have stopped falling? So in 5th century Greek philosophy, Empedocles described elements as the roots of the physical world. And he offered up 4 elements. They'll be familiar: fire and earth and air and water as the constitutive world-making properties. In the Chinese philosophy called the Wu Qing, 5 elemental forms appear: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. In the Wu Qing, elements are much more like phases and relationships than they are unified or unchanging properties. The elements of the Wu Qing are animated by their potential to transform and to reinvent themselves in relation to one another. They are inherently relational and transformational in their relations. Indigenous people all over the world also reckon with elements in many multiple ways. For example, for some Kanaka Maoli people, the original residents of the islands of Hawaii, elemental forms are designated as aqua. So in one prayer, Kapule Akane, dozens of Kane Aqua, or cloud elements, are described. So we have Kane in the cloud, floating low. We have Kane resting on the summit. We have Kane in the fog. We have Kane in the mist, and we have Kane of the whirlwind. These cloud aqua are only a few of Kanaka Maoli's people's 400,000 elemental forms. If the Greeks had 4, Kanaka Maoli people have 400,000. So I think you can see there's an incredible diversity across how we imagine these elemental forms. In the English language of the 16th century, weather itself came to represent the elements. We aimed to protect ourselves from these elements. to take shelter, to respect the cacophony that would sometimes come from the sky. And in the late 19th century, the elements became neatly captured and codified in the periodic table. Built from 118 elements, these are meant to represent all the known materials of the universe. These are the building blocks for what Sheila Jasanoff calls the necessary abstractions of the scientific project. The table that periodicity provides is also a loop of infinite possibility for assemblage and reassemblage, reformation and reorientation. Elements here become stuck and unstuck, charged and fused by one another through chemical bonds or wrested apart through shifts in their ontological form. So given the incredible range and differences that we can see in just these examples of elemental forms, I want to proffer a provisionary definition for the elements, one that offers us room to move and to think through their complexities and their distinct cosmological capacities. So for a definition, elements are how we, across human communities, understand the composition of ourselves and our worlds. Therefore, like us and our worlds, the elements, their shape and their definition, their names and their corporeal compositions, their mutabilities and their consistencies are also different and distinct across space and time. As I go back in time and begin rereading the canon of my own discipline, anthropology, I am very struck by the fact that the elements were always in the texture of living that was being authored in these ethnographic texts, but they were not the analytic focus of the story. So some of you will know that the so-called father of American anthropology, Franz Boas, was originally trained as a physicist, and Boas's dissertation was actually on the color of seawater. So there's this long genealogy of the discipline of anthropology that connects us back to the physical world and to physics itself as this kind of discipline. But also to point out that these elements were always the context and the condition. It's just that most ethnographers never thought to center and focus them. I think they were always there in the texture. So let's take it as an example, the fact that Earth itself is always very central to the terraforming that occurs when mines are carved into the crust of the planet. And yet Earth has rarely been the epistemic or analytic center of anthropological attention when it comes to analyzing the qualities of mines, both for their harms and their benefits. When metals and minerals are unearthed from the subsurface in the form of gold or tin or tantalum or copper, for example, these are opportunities to underscore the relationship between human labors and the extractive wealths that are left in the aftermath of mines. But this requires an attention to those qualities. When we forgo the elemental qualities of the things we commonly call resources, we are missing something fundamental about their material impact. And I'll say that this is a mine in Australia, and some of you will recognize that this is the photographer Edward Bertinsky, who does very beautiful images of often very disturbing landscapes and disturbed landscapes. Recently, the chemical elements have been recognized as complex, multi-sided, and multiscalar phenomena in the form of silicon or bromine or magnesium or mercury or phosphorus, to name just a few. Ethnographers have been showing us how chemicals exercise themselves through and with human bodies. The inanimate protagonists of chemicals also occupy non-human bodies, finding homes across dozens of species. PFAS, for example, these forever chemicals that we've been hearing about quite a bit, are highly mobile. They're continuously cycling through the environment. They do not break down. They can be carried long distances through the atmosphere. And that is how they reach into the bodies of remote creatures and landscapes like polar bears in the Arctic or glacial masses on the other side of the world in Antarctica. So my point here is that elemental attentions, again, are not wholly new. They're not entirely new, but the catastrophic impacts of climate disruption, increased toxicities in our environments, now really truly demand that the elements are not just one dimension of the story, not just incidental or contextual, but really a central principle to guide particular kinds of inquiry. Elements are those things that we have thoroughly manipulated, from chemical brews to rechanneled waterways, and those like raging fires and parching drought that have now outgrown any human fantasies of control, that were always only ever a colonial anthropocentric fallacy to begin with. So while the elements have always been our everything, I proceed from the position that there are two interlocked reasons for attuning our attentions more fully to them. One, our environments are feeling increasingly and dramatically elemental. Take as a statistic that roughly 90% of the counties in the United States, 90% have experienced a weather-related disaster. This is extraordinary. Two, the elements invite us in a reciprocal move to feel our way through this condition. And by feel, I mean emotionally and also in a sensorial capacity, to literally encounter the elements as physical force, but also as affective prompt. Because if we now live in times of environmental distress, which I am certain that we do, it is also true that life goes on. Elemental attentions can also bring us to a place to seek out moments in the unfolding crescendos of vitality and fluorescence. Because in the wake of every fire that burns in the Amazon or in the mountains of Santa Cruz are the shoots and roots that follow in their wake. So, what forms could our elemental attentions take? And what can we imagine as an analytic method or an analytic? And here I want to offer just a few ways forward, which really are only a start. This is not a manifesto, it's not a program, it's not a guidebook, it's a set of propositions. Okay, we could follow an element like potassium, chlorine, or nitrogen to see how it operates across social worlds. What if we followed Kane in the fog, or water as it melts and meets or recedes from land? Indeed, what if we could follow water as it melts and becomes sea level rise? What if we could travel with a drop of water from a glacier in the Arctic, expiring in the Arctic to where it is becoming ocean and eventually becoming rising seas? So in my current research, I've had the opportunity to sit down with the lead physicist who has developed a device, a model, that can do just that. It can follow the water. And he explains it this way. He said, melt ice anywhere in the world, and we can show you the shape that the ocean will adopt. This model, which is called the gradient fingerprint map, shows us that when glacial regions melt, in Iceland and Greenland, for example, that you see here in red, there are many surprising outcomes. Melt, in fact, manifests as ocean in very, very counterintuitive ways. For example, when the glaciers of Iceland melt, there is no city in the world that feels the effects of that melt more than Cape Town, South Africa. So this city, so very, very far away geographically and experientially in many ways, experiences more sea level rise than any other city on Earth when the glaciers of Iceland melt into the sea. In Iceland, the site of that meltwater This fishing trawler that you see in the port can now only exit and enter that port at high tide. This is because the land around the port in this little town called Hope has been rising at about 1 inch per year. The port and the land is rising at about 1 inch per year because lost ice on this mountain, on this island nation state. Lost ice means less weight on the island, on the country's surface. This causes it to rebound more dramatically. It's called isostatic rebounding, and it effectively means that Iceland and other places are rising up out of the sea. In Cape Town, South Africa, they brace for the effects of that Icelandic meltwater with sandbags or what's sometimes called shoreline hardening. And these are becoming more and more common. Nearly all of Cape Town's most important beaches are now under threat from rising sea levels and coastal erosion. So this is an image that I took at Milnerton Beach during my fieldwork there in 2024. If you've been to Cape Town lately, you will see this shoreline hardening everywhere along those beaches. By following the water, I have found an elemental way through the routes and passages of what scientists call the world ocean. The world ocean is fundamentally being reshaped under the weight of climate disruption. And spin, the world as it pivots across the Earth's rotational axis, is a key dynamic in the transformation of the world ocean, as gravity begins to pull at that world ocean in different and complex ways. What if we were to implode the elements and collapse them inward to surface the social relations and points of contact that the element itself manifests or perpetuates or invites? This is neodymium sulfate. It turns pink when burned. A late 19th century chemistry journal described it like this. When the white crystals again separated, the subsequent fractions became more and more intensely pink until finally the beautiful rose red salts of the neodymium and samarium earths were formed. Neodymium is one of the famed rare earth minerals. Its magnetic properties were discovered in the 1960s, but in the 1980s, several research groups in Japan and the United States announced the discovery of a new compound composed of neodymium, iron, and boron. This was the starting point for the rare earth magnet. This is the strongest magnet on the planet. And it's critically important for electric car motors and wind turbines and medical devices everywhere on Earth. Neodymium is found in the ground in places like Greenland, where Greenland Minerals and Energy, an Australian company, is developing an extraction site at Kvanefjeld. They describe their mine as, quote, having the potential to become the most significant Western world producer of rare earths. Neodymium, a central component of the Kvanefjeld deposit, is used to produce the magnets used in wind energy technologies, as well as renewable energy globally. The Inuit Ottaquatkut political party, which has seen surges in popularity in Greenland in recent years, is thoroughly opposed to the Kvanefjeld mine. So if extractive interests and miners see gold in neodymium, that does need to be matched with how in Greenland, the collective imaginary is very differently aspirational. They are aiming for sovereignty, for nationhood, and for full political independence from the Kingdom of Denmark, much less inclusion in the United States, I might add. The great majority of Greenlanders are indigenous Inuit people whose ancestors migrated from the northern reaches of Canada, what's now called Canada, and Alaska after 1200. These are also the successors to many other indigenous peoples that have inhabited this land since at least the year 2500 BC. From Greenlanders' point of view, these are their elements, those embedded in the stones, and they're elements of ice and wind and water that surrounds the largest island on Earth. One that many seek to make an island no more by including it more deeply in the geopolitical economy of minerals and extraction. So here you see some of these mineral deposits up close from the Kujannafelt site. When we implode the element, we reveal these kinds of geopolitical designs around mineral extraction, around the labor of minerals, in projects of energy transition and technological development. And we're also directed to the ongoing dreams of decolonization. Although we may think of chemicals as infinitesimal entities, they are in fact anything but. They are enormous, engulfing structures of meaning and material form that move, that alight, and that become trace. So chemicals illustrate the multiple dimensions of toxicity and relationality. We are part of chemicals and they are part of us. Their immensity is actually captured very intimately in our bodily forms. Take plastic, for example. This is a beautiful thing. We know this because we have surrounded ourselves with it. Look around you. It appears in every corner of our world. It is handles and wheels, boxes and bread bags, trinket, talisman, tape. It is the warp and weft of the petro-modern. It absorbs shapes in miraculous ways, morphing into cylindrical tanks and delicate tools. It also bulges to become an inflatable pool on a hot, hot day, one that is becoming hotter still. Plastic holds air like a lung, except better and longer. Plastic secures. It is an infinitely mutable, changeable thing, sucking up color and inspiration. What entity is more transfigural than plastic? This is a wonder born from the earth, a wonder born from chemicals, a wonder of fabulation and form, a handsome material to craft a more beautiful world full of fresh possibilities. Think of how we wrap our old meat. A palette of color, the persuasive shapeshifter. We are the plastic fantastic lovers. But plastic is also a terrifying thing. We know this because we have surrounded ourselves with it. Look around you. It now resides in the deepest recesses of the ocean. Little bits of it litter the lowest canyon on Earth. It is touching us always, woven into our lives at every stitch, piercing the organic world with real dexterity and duration and ubiquity. At every turn it appears. Try going a day without it, without having it somewhere in your service, in your head. Hello, toothbrush. Leavened from oil through the cruel magic of petrochemical engineering, plastic appeared on the horizon so innocently. Bakelite, the first synthetic plastic, such a pretty name, like a fluffy pink cupcake you might give to a child. This name is not so pretty. That is the one that is made into pipes and insulators and guns. How much plastic does it take to make a war? Plastic is a leaky thing. It breaks down, it fails under the pressures of liquid and the rays of the sun. It evaporates, but slowly. It is particles in the making and the unmaking. It permeates, coming into bodies discreetly through invisible channels. or indiscreetly inserted into our cyborgian selves. Prosthetics, replacement parts, microplastic ingestions. Max Lieberon and their team tell us that plastic is pollution and that pollution is colonialism. These are vectors of petrochemical imperialism, forcing into bodies and changing them, sickening them. Bird bodies, human bodies, oceanic bodies, astral bodies. Plastic is transcorporeal. It crosses the line. Elemental attentions might encourage us to sense more deeply, attuning to the chemosphere through breathing and olfactory cues. One will also feel the hail or the heat of the fire. Sense is emotional and corporeal. We know that the weather of the future will be different, hotter and wetter, but also drier and colder. In most all ways, different. We may become nostalgic for the way that weather was, how it felt across a neck, how it tasted on our tongues, how it sounded through rocks and grasses and trees. This kind of vernacular climate knowledge will begin to fade. The weather that we once felt standing on a cliff at the edge of the Pacific at dawn, or in the bright heat of the Sahara, reflecting off golden dunes, that will be forever changed. Weathering is a process of being worn down, of becoming dilapidated and diminished by time and exposure. Chronic contact with inequalities produces its own kind of weathering, an accelerated decline in human health and well-being brought on by structural systems of disadvantage and marginalization. Future weather, the more than human forces of wind and storm and water now contextualize a temporal frame of thick time. But this is also a way to reimagine our bodies as archives of climate. Seen through the elemental form of weather, our human bodies are archival documents. They narrate an elemental compendium of effect, like pollutants and heat, and affect, our ambivalences and our appreciations for weathering the weather. What does it mean to inhabit the storm, to be in the weather world? These are the kinds of questions that we need to ask. This is, on the one hand, a philosophical question, but it is also, of course, an existential question. What does it mean to inhabit the storm and to be in the weather world? Some of you will remember that at first there were forest fires. That's what they were called. And then there were wildfires, what we call them now. And now there are also firestorms, fires that make their own weather. How to weather that storm? Let's listen to this fire. When fires broke out, they burned so uncontrollably and so quickly that some people had to swim into the sea to survive. In the end, it was the deadliest fire in the United States in over 100 years. Lahaina was once the royal capital of the Kingdom of Hawaii. The fire destroyed its historic center and the Waiula Church, the oldest on the island. The pastor of that church said, "This community, this village is intense. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows your parents. Everyone knows your grandparents. So you really can't get away with much because people are watching, but they're also guiding you. They're also protecting you as much as they can." Yeah, that's how strong this community is, okay? So we went thinking, okay, they'll get it contained, but you couldn't even see the ocean. All we saw was black smoke. And I said, oh my God, this fire is going to go across the road to the families down there. And I had my own moments where I started crying because thinking about all the families and the friends and, the loss. So Augustine writes that scale is a verb that requires precision. Elemental attentions that move from an infinitesimal dose of oxygen to the dimensions of air and all that it carries are a way to hone that precision. I think that the verb of scale finds its noun in the elements. Elements bring us in close, but they also take us far. From one drop of meltwater, we go to the world ocean. In following, imploding, tracing, sensing, inhabiting, and scaling the elements, we are seeking out renewed moments of contact of and for us and of and for our worlds. So our projects of attention have always been aspirational, that I recognize. They've always been hoping to convey both the beauty and the precarity of intimacy, as well as the immensity of being in the world. In the elements, we find new ways of being in the wake and the quake of this surround. So Simone White is a poet, but I think that the best of our intellectual attentions have always been committed to noticing the unnoticed and acknowledging the respiratory. And so I think she puts it really beautifully when she writes, "The difference is respiratory, unnoticed." So, as we navigate what often feels like a perilous future, a return to the roots of ourselves and of our Earth system toward our elemental forms may be able to better point us toward new ways forward, toward more just horizons, and to where the respiratory is noticed, and the difference is in being there for it. Thank you.
So, yeah, I think we have plenty of time for discussion, so welcome anybody to get us started. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks. That was very terrific. I learned a lot. I did want to ask about temporality as well, because temporality was woven into every bit that you mentioned, including the block of life. But when I think about the elements, I mean, that's one thing I hate about the elements, is that any atom of copper is the same as any other atom. I mean, it seems elements seem to stand outside of time. You know, they're the only things in the universe that say don't have historicity. So it's one thing you weave together, you know, both this, you know, intense focus on temporality and also the ahistorical elements.
I mean, it's curious that, thank you for the question, Jeff, and it's great to see you here. It's interesting to me that you say that elements are the only thing that we say that exists out of time or has no historicity, because I think in many ways, at least in the Western logic, we think of the elements as fundamentally creating history. And of course, I'm thinking of the Big Bang. I'm thinking of the way that the elements that we now have on Earth came to arrive here through their travels as part of that very elemental physical process. And that the constitutive elements of the universe, as we understand them in our humble way with our 118 chemical elements and the matter of the universe, really emerges from that moment of history, that point of origin. But I don't want to disagree too strenuously with the atemporality, because there is another dimension where elemental forms, especially mineral forms, are thought to have this sort of ongoing eternal life where they can be purposed and repurposed and taken fundamentally as resources in their own right. They're not living, and perhaps that's why we don't think of them intuitively as having a history, as having a lifespan, as having a cycle, like we do with a human life or an animal life, or even the life of a country or a conflict. but instead something that is sort of ontologically stable for eternity. But we also know that they're not, right? I mean, I think of the kind of the elements of plastic, which of course were born from something that once lived, born from an organic form, made into this petrochemical formation, then made to last for a very long time, but not forever, because they ultimately will break down and redistribute and become part of our bodies, which we know they are now, part of, in our brains and in our muscles and in all our corporeal forms. So if they do try and evade history, they do seem to find themselves wound into it in different ways, I think. And it would certainly depend on the element. When I think about, for example, a place where I've just been doing a little bit of research, and that's in Hawaii, where this question of water, a different elemental form, like sort of moving away from the periodic table, water is such an essential dynamic of how people understand land and their place in the world. It's actually like a water formation. Water, that the Kane in the clouds, like the Kane begins at the top of the mountain and you have the release of water and it comes down through the valley and it nurtures and fertilizes the valley. And then it comes down into the ocean, it comes down to the coast. And the very end of that space of that landscape as it's understood is the reef, the edge of the reef. And so there's a continuum from the water cycle that begins in the mountains, comes down to the reef and then cycles back up into the mountains again. And so there's a deep historicity for those folks, for Kanaka Maoli people around that elemental form. And in fact, how it shapes and names and conditions their landscape and what they understand to be their home.
I have Zach and then Donna.
Hello, I'm talking about. Thank you very much. I had a question, but I think before that, and just building Jeff's comment, maybe this is like a friendly suggestion of adding periodizing for one of your elemental methodologies, just to play on the periodic table.
Oh,
this sense of
that's cool.
morality.
I like that, Zach, in the back. That's cool.
So that was the nice offering, but then I also have another question about, I know it's provisional and it's work in progress, and so I hope the comment is in that spirit. And it struck me that most of the methods are passive.
How so?
Trace, maybe sense.
Okay.
And then inhabit and scale seems like being with it, but only implode seemed like the more active of the methodologies. And I was wondering if there's more space for like a combinatory methodology and maybe thinking about like alchemical traditions and dealing with elements in a kind of like more creative like creation fashion.
Interesting. So think like performing it more like a chemist in a way. Is that what you're thinking? Sort of a captivating?
Yeah, it struck me. I mean, I understand the resistance to like, an extractivist paradigm, and so tempering the kind of ways that we interact methodologically with the elements and what you're trying to propose. But it just struck me that imploding was the only really like active process in the methodology, and I just think that there is a tradition of trying to manipulate elements or combine elements that
Right.
might possibly be another pathway to follow.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting insight. I haven't thought of that before, and I haven't thought about this sort of active or passive explicitly. But I would say that when I'm working with the idea of trace, it's very active. I mean, I'm talking about tracing in the form of tracking. And this, this drop of meltwater that falls off a glacier in Iceland and ends up in Cape Town, tracking that is a very complicated process that I need the help of physicists to be able to do that. And it's also a complicated process from a social science point of view, in the sense that I need to understand what's happening in this place in Iceland and how that's impacting the changes in their environment, their worlds, how it then travels through the world ocean and then ends up in Cape Town. These are all very active ways of tracing not just the physical property, although it kind of begins with that as a heuristic, but also the social changes and contingencies that are enacted in these two locations. And one of the interesting things I found out of that project, this Meltmise project, is the sheer distance between these places also forces us to think about the very different social worlds that are being co-located now more closely through climate disruption. So it's not that Iceland and Cape Town were not connected before through the world ocean. That's the same. But now they're becoming connected more radically, more intensively, more substantially, in very clear and traceable ways. And yet these places are very different socially. Like, they have very different histories. They don't do a lot of trading with one another. They're not sort of shared scapes of interaction. There's not a lot of finance and migration and language sharing or any of these sorts of dynamics that we think of going on between these two places. There's some, but very little historically. There's not a lot of shared social DNA there. The imploding, I think, is that's the kind of most obvious active one, but I think I would say that sense is also active too. I mean, what I'm hoping people might take away from this is that this sensing is something that we would do in a very embodied way. And there's been a stream in my discipline in anthropology towards sensory ethnography and using these other capacities beyond the kind of obvious ocular vision to be able to use our sensory capacities as an ethnographic guidepost or route toward understanding, both for the people that we're working with and as ethnographers ourselves. So I think that sense is also, as I'm thinking of it, much more active. Inhabit, yeah, maybe that one's a little, that's sort of, you're just sitting there being there. Maybe that's a little more kind of phenomenologically quiet.
Which is okay, I mean.
Which is cool too, yeah.
It's an observation.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, I like the observation. I like the question of sort of the activity or the non-activity. I think that's a useful observation. So thank you, Steph.
So this one with your verb,
Yes, the noun.
as a noun and a verb.
Yes. So maybe I could play with that too, I think. Maybe it's about taking the scale, the verb scale into noun. And maybe you guys noticed that with scale, I didn't give you an example. I kind of left that one hanging there. So if anyone has great ideas for a scale project, I'd love to hear that. I kind of chickened out around scale, but I think that I know there's something there. I just don't know if I have it in my little research repertoire as it is right now.
I have Donna, John, did you guys? And Vilash.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's so much to work with, and I love the poetics. I love the attention to sensuality and materiality and specificity of place, and the invocation that there are many kinds of elemental forms and so on and so forth. But what I miss is an explicit appreciation in your list of things that you're valuing of analytics.
Okay.
You do plenty of analysis, but you don't name it as something of value with the poetics and the sensual and the so forth and so on. And I think that causes a problem.
Okay.
I have the sense you move so quickly from one elemental form to another to do various kinds of work, but I want more stopping to say, what are the consequences of this kind of tracking of this kind? I'm thinking from Marilyn Strathern's invocation that it matters which thoughts think thoughts.
Yes.
Well, how does it matter?
Yes.
So that if you're in Lahaina and tracking the movement of water and fire from through the changes in the history of the land that allow those particular movements of water and fire.
Yeah.
So what and for whom? It's implicit,
Uh-huh.
but they'll move in quickly.
Yeah.
And I remember years ago when I wrote Modest Witness of Second Millennium, I decided to track not uranium, but nitrogen. And I tracked nitrogen through the industrial labs of the 19th century German industrial labs. I tracked it through explosives and fertilizers and proteins and so on and so on, and ended up quite deliberately producing a world in which nitrogen was the actor and the player. And it tied certain social worlds together and not others, and cost some lives and not others. And what I miss in your story, there's a sense that that is just beyond what you're saying to be able to do that. But then we shift to elemental form, with climate destruction being the principal unifier.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm asking is whether, if you foregrounded analytics as one of the positive, one of the valued categories in what you're doing, how would it change the talk you're giving? That's maybe too big a question, but if you took a couple of examples of things you were doing and didn't move quite so quickly, the implication, what is to be done might come up, or who lives and who dies, how and how might that be modified? Those questions don't come up, and I think it's because the movement from elemental form to elemental form happens so seamlessly.
I think, thank you, Donna. This is and thank you for reminding us too about Uncle Mouse. It's fantastic. And I think it's also really pertinent to our moment right now as we're thinking, because nitrogen has become a huge issue now with this war, right? And fertilizers and the
But you could take the whole chemical periodical table and do world histories.
Yes.
Interesting. Nitrogen is all and good, but you could do all kinds of interesting, in my view, string figure games by tracking these elements. Tracking would be the relevant verb, not imploding.
Yes.
Although that does a really interesting kind of work. Other kind of work.
Yes. So yes, and people are doing that, right? I mean, there are people who are working, like you, I mean, I think you were an early forerunner in this, but there are people who are sort of following the phosphorus, following the silicon. I have these references in here that you can't see, but people are working on these topics and they're following or tracking these different elemental forms that are on the periodic table, the sort of hagiography of Western science, this periodic table. So that is one way to do it. And I think that's an interesting approach. It has a bit of a sort of a chain or a network kind of analytic or logic to it. I wonder if we might think in more recombinatory names and processes and maybe analytics by blending some of these elemental forms together. And this is where I do come back to climate again. And I understand that this condition is kind of the frame for what I'm talking about and thinking about here. And that is the current climate crisis is a combination of many elemental forms coming into play together in relation. So the problem with the atmosphere is too many chemicals in it. There's too many pieces of the periodic table now living in the atmosphere above us that's creating a greenhouse effect, that's creating warming on the planet. But that in turn, those chemicals are then causing weather systems to be quite destructive and to make it so that 90% of the counties in the United States have had these weather-related disasters. So I think what I'm trying to sort of highlight here is that, and the world ocean is being reshaped, right? So there's many ways that we could do it, but it's like taking together all of these elemental forms, if we put them into conversation with each other analytically, and kind of juxtapose and prop them together with one another, we can see something about a larger dynamic at work that might be useful for moving us forward around questions of who lives and who does not live, for whom is this done and for what reason, right? And I think that's where you're getting at the key core questions about the values that we bring to research, what our purpose is in doing them. And, I've been having conversations with people who work on the elements, and one of the sticky questions I have for myself and for this whole kind of line of thought is the political question. Like, is there, this is one of our questions that we're going to get to, is there a politics of the elements? And if so, what does it look like? And how do we not have, if there is a politics of the elements, how does it not just sort of redact into becoming resources or commodity chains? Or a kind of, fascination with the air, like a kind of a more ephemeral take on things. So how do we sort of activate those politics around these elemental forms? But I think there is hope there. And I think it will take people working in this space more continuously, younger people, graduate students, postdocs, others kind of moving into, thank you, Mr. Earl. You satisfied or not?
We're going for deep stuff, so.
Yeah.
I'm loving what you're doing, but enough, we'll talk later.
Okay.
I have John Vilashni Max. John?
Thank you for this beautiful talk and generous offering to elemental methodologies. I'm a student in the literature department, so I'm thinking about training for power plants, the literary narratives around it. So the question that came up with me in your talk was thinking about like the periodic table. Maybe my question is related to that, of how the way that we experience the elements has a wide range, and whether that exceeds a periodic table, but also surrounded by it in some ways. So how do we think about, for example, the mix of, let's say, radiological, the kind of contaminated hazardous fluids, dust, water, indigenous bodies are made to do the cleanup work that I tested on. How do we think about this mashup of elements in relation to the periodic table? I was wondering if you can talk on it in terms of the elemental properties of it. So you would be without this.
I mean, one of the interesting things I've learned about the periodic table and just doing a bit of historical research on it is how many times it's appeared. There's been many of them. And, we've been standardized now, but there's been many iterations. So it's kind of interesting to think that this in itself was never a completely codified, sort of regimented entity, that it evolved and became over time. And also that some of the elements on that periodic table we have not seen or touched, like they're kind of theoretical substances. So that's interesting as well. But in terms of thinking, you were working on nuclear plants, did you say?
Nuclear power plants, nuclear energy.
Yeah, nuclear energy. Well, that's a really interesting one in terms of the historiography too, isn't it? When we think about uranium and how that is both a dynamic at the site of extraction. In the United States, for example, a lot of Navajo people have been contaminated by the extraction of uranium, but also at the end of the fuel cycle for those nuclear elements, we need to find a place to put them. And it turns out it's very difficult to quote unquote dispose of them because they really don't go away for a long time and they seep into places in water and bodies and earth. So I think it's a very interesting topic and one that's very complicated. But the periodic table is it's a fascinating object, and I think Sheila Jasanoff's words are interesting in the sense that it is this necessary abstraction for science to be able to disaggregate, right? To understand what the core constituents are of these forms. And so the kind of disaggregation, from my point of view, is what's key to the periodic table. But if we think about the kind of track that an elemental attention might take, I would want to see it more aggregating. I would want to see taking some of these elemental forms, but actually see them in interaction and in process with other qualities, other entities, other landscapes, other bodies, to see how they aggregate. And there are ethnographers who are working on what they're calling chemical ethnography and sort of looking at like formaldehyde. There's a great book on formaldehyde and how that kind of gets into the human body. So there's really interesting work in that space of people sort of thinking this through. So it's not entirely new, but I appreciate your question. And I think we need to keep the periodic table as an important kind of ally or a kind of a code maybe a codex, that has a certain orientation, but not to understand it as the entirety of all the ways that we can understand elements. That would be my worry, is that I don't want it, I wouldn't want elemental attentions to kind of just be the kind of Western science version of elements. Or for that matter, the Greek version, right? Earth, air, fire, and water. I think there's much more.
I have Ilajne, Max, and Brian.
Thank you so much, for this talk, it was really provocative and the constellation of all the things you're working with, I find really, really enticing. So I love this question that you phrased, I think in response to Donna, is there a politics of the elements and what does it look like? I think that's really marvelous. And it seems to me that one provisional answer that comes out of that is precisely the tension between what you're calling the Western logic and apparatus of the table or the chart or the taxonomy, and a whole set of diagnostic and linear technologies, like a certain kind of historicization of how work works, with everything that means in nuclear contexts, or how certain kinds of combinations create a sort of progressive use of an element, like the story you tell about plastic. So on the one hand, there's a kind of utility model of how to tell the story of the element. It's deeply embedded in capitalist logics, right? On the other hand, there is a story about the politics of the elements that is about what you use early in the talk as this idea of how do they move, right? So what is the dance of the table?
Yeah.
With a shout out to Marx, I guess. But
Yeah.
what is the combinatory logic? What is it about elements are both themselves and not themselves in their combinations? How is that a kind of invitation to think in a scalar way that is both micro, whatever, phosphorus itself, and networked or more macro? I know nothing about what phosphorus combines with, but whatever it combines with. And here, I was thinking about how you might take the work of Estrida Neymanes on water as a kind of parallel to what it means to take the element itself in its movement, right? In its watery, non-ipseity, not, like its multiplicity as a thing, as an invitation. So I'd be curious about how, it's not just thinking with specific elements, but about what the elemental is as an epistemological invitation, because it's not fixed, right?
Right.
And then my other question is about the tension in the talk between thinking the elements through the senses and thinking the elements analogically as a kind of language. Because you talk so much about like what is the earth utter, how are we archived, like of the elements, what are these documents? I mean, in the first part of the talk, it's that's the driving figure. And I'm interested in how you were thinking about the tension between what it means to think sensorially and what it means to take the elements as yet another kind of language that opens itself to reading practices as opposed to the senses. And here I'm thinking a lot of Nadia Sedimentakis, the senses still, and what does it mean to do a sensory ethnography, and what does it mean to think of places and practices rather than of documents and archives. So that was a bunch of stuff, but I was really excited by your ideas.
Cool, thank you. Great, these are great questions, provocations. Let me see if I can recall them all. I think that the question about language is really interesting. And I would need to really think through how the term elemental operates in different linguistic semantics and different linguistic systems. If we just stick with English, it has a definitional quality of being fundamental, right? And that's where you get this idea of the building blocks, right, in the periodic table. So these elements are foundational qualities. There's a concreteness, there's an ontological unification in their corporeal selves. That's very interesting, but also foundational in the sense that it's elemental that we respect one another. It's elemental that we pursue democratic value, etc. I mean, there's all these ways that elements of the elemental, which you're playing with here, which I'm interested in, gets used in different sorts of conditions to talk about things that are very different, at least obviously different. I'm sure you can find connection, but obviously different from these different ways that we're imagining the elements as physical properties that interact.
Right.
I love that you brought up Astrid Nijmenessa's work. She's amazing. I love her work. I love her work on water. She's got a new book out with a co-author called How We Weather Together. And it's about weather, and there's a touch of it that's about weathering. This weathering is a concept that's been used more recently in public health debates. And weathering as a condition, as something that affects people who are from marginalized communities, people who suffer racism and classism and all kinds of social inequalities of various kinds, and how that affects their physical health in terms of disease and lifespan. And so there's a whole developing public health literature around that, the question of weathering. So I think there's a lot to be found in the social space around what it means to inhabit the weather. And this kind of goes back to your point too, Donna, about it depends on who you are and where you weather that, how it comes to play upon your body. But yeah, Astrid's stuff on water is also super interesting. And then there was another piece to your question.
There's a piece about thinking with the elements, and then there's a piece about the tension between the senses and the linguistic.
Yes.
And then I was also interested, I guess, in what it would mean to think in a scalar way with the elements, right? Yeah, both as particular distinct elements, but also in a combinatorial way. And what is it about, if we want to call it something like elemental process?
Yeah.
As opposed to elemental matter.
Yeah.
I mean, not that matter doesn't have process, but.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting too, because there is a kind of irresolvability there. You have process and you have physical form and how that becomes interactive. And I think there is a kind of an automatic tension between those two. Maybe there doesn't need to be. I think, the Chinese philosophy of elements is really different. There's these, 5 sort of conditional forms, but they're really about, the whole reason to designate them is because of their relationship with each other. So what fire does to wood, or what water might do to wood, or what air gives to fire, which is life. And so that is an elemental system that really is about relationality and the transformation of substances. So it's about substance and process all at once, and very much about combination, but also decomposition. In the same way that the periodic table is really about decomposition, like it really is about exacting the most unique form of matter that we can decipher. Which is again why I think it's so exciting for science. Like it's got that appeal. And we need that appeal because we make a lot of use out of it, for good and for bad, but we do use it quite a lot. Great questions, thank you.
We have 9 minutes left and I have 2 questions. Anybody else? Because maybe we can take them together so that, yeah.
Each time I would add one, but.
Okay, so Max, Brian,
Right.
and Brian. Yeah,
I should keep it shorter too.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
mostly the questions, we want to hear you, so you can keep the question shorter so that we can hear the last words as yours. Max, Brian.
Okay, I will try to keep my question short, and thank you. Obviously, I was very intrigued by the politics of the elements.
Yeah.
And maybe there's some work that has to be done about the common language. So what does it mean politics? What does it mean the politics of elements? So I try to express what I think and what the politics of the elements can look like.
Mhm.
So, because I think, first of all, it requires some historical investigation, and it requires an historical answer, I suppose. When I say history, I don't mean so much the history of elements as such. I mean the historical dimension of humans' encounter with the elements.
Mhm.
So that encounter takes place in a social world.
Right.
And to my understanding, the social world is always an historical world.
Mhm.
So this is, I think this is where the politics of the elements should begin, should start in that form, in that specific form of historicity. Because when I think of, let's say, the Western modernity, well, let me say something about that. So in the Western modernity, we have a very specific relationship with the war and with the elements.
Mhm.
We can say, and I think in this room we can agree that it's a kind of a destructive relationship. But now this is the point. So the point is this relationship, this encounter has become distracted because of a wrong epistemology or a wrong philosophy. That would have been kind of I would say, a bad Heideggerian answer. Oh, let's go back and we can start from scratch.
Mhm.
And for Heidegger, that the starting from scratch was Parmenides. Parmenides in this room can be Empedocles, maybe.
Mhm.
But I would say this is still a kind of a Heideggerian answer. Now the answer is that, oh, the relationship is bad and destructive because there are evil humans, or there are greed, or whatever we want to call it. But that is moralistic. I'm just using, my repertoire.
Yeah.
So, and I would say that is still not an answer because it's moralistic. That means, oh, they are bad and evil, whereas other people are good.
Mhm.
I don't like it. I don't buy it.
Mhm.
Or we have to think in this kind of historical encounter with the elements. But then I can find at the beginning of almost that Western, what we call Western modernity, a very specific forms of property relations in which at a certain point nature has been externalized and nature became something dead, just a material that we can use.
Yeah.
But now we have the difficulty, and that difficulty is that basically we reproduce our property relations daily in everything we do.
Mhm.
Our habits. When I buy a coffee, I reproduce property relations.
Yeah.
I reproduce this form of legalities that in a certain way is a complicit with this externalization of elements, nature, whatever we want to call it, is reproduced in every single thing we do. So now back to the question, what a politics of the element looks like.
Mhm.
So it's something that has to address our legal systems, the form we organize our society, our social world
Mhm.
as a constituted by laws, economics, property, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That's-
Is there a question or?
It's a question.
Okay.
It's about the politics of the elements.
So, I mean, it could be that a politics of the elements is undoing capitalist modes of production. It could be that might be the ultimate direction that an elemental politics could take. That would be to think of the elements very much in the resource framework. I'm not opposed to that, but I think that would be to sort of reduce it in some ways to only that. Property relations, extraction, the circulation of commodities, the things that we are embroiled in every day. I think your points remind me a bit of this discussion that's been ongoing around this category of the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, right? And so I know that people in this room and also, Jason W. Moore, someone who's spoken a lot about the Capitalocene and the way that nature has been made into a commodity at a grand scale. That's an argument that I would say, yes, it's true, but also we do also have human beings who are not as deeply embroiled in capitalist systems who are also doing extractive work. And we can look back historically to the Soviet Union, for example, that was not a capitalist state, but that was exercising a lot of perilous acts upon the natural system through extraction, through the burning of fossil fuel resources, et cetera. So I think the question you're asking or proposing is gigantic. It's sort of like that, the end of the world versus the end of capitalism kind of conundrum, right? Which can we imagine more easily? But if we go back to the Heideggerian kind of concerns about Umwelt, that is the world as we might be able to constitute it, one of those politics needs to be pushing against further capitalist incursions in which we're embroiled. But I would say not only. I don't think that that's the end of the story in that sense, because we are all actors in this system, but we are in other ways actors in other systems of relationship. Was that your question was like, how we fix the world? So I love that question. And I'm not going to pretend to try and know that answer, but if we can figure it out in the next couple of minutes, that would be excellent for the world.
Someone say hello.
Oh yeah, that's my husband and child. They didn't have to listen to my rooms today.
She's visiting, so we need to be nice so that she comes to live here. This is amazing. We have two more, Brian and Brian, and that sounds really nice as well.
Hi, thank you so much. I thought you were a poet, and then you gave us so much to think about anthropology. That was awesome. I'm curious about how the form of the wave appears in your research.
Oh.
And might the wave or wave riding be something to help us think about a scalar example that you mentioned? I'll take through.
Brian is writing about waves. So
I like that.
It's an interesting question.
So then you must know all about stuff on Helmreich
Yeah.
and his wave. So I won't reiterate that. So there's a lot of wave stuff there. Yeah, the wave is very interesting in the sense that it does not appear in this tracking or tracing that I do of the droplet of water from the melting glaciers to the world ocean and to Cape Town, because that model that was developed by these physicists is not a circulation model, it's a gravitational model. And so when that physicist up there that I quoted who said that we can show you the shape that the ocean will take, that's literally what he means. So they can actually track holes in the ocean. And that is how they describe these, that they're actual like carved out holes in the ocean in terms of the gravitational difference that is made when you take mass from on top of the world, like Greenland, that's melting at a massively quick rate. When you take that mass away, it appears as mass on the other side of the world. And so that's why you have this effect of melting glaciers in Iceland becoming sea level rise in Cape Town. It's not because waves are coming, it's not because of ocean currents or tidal qualities, it's got nothing to do with that. It's all about this physical model that they've been able to calculate that also takes into account the gravitational rotational feedback of the Earth's liquid envelope. These are physicist terms, very complicated. I have read the papers, I understand the papers as best as I can. But it's a very different model than we think of, I think intuitively when we think of waves. Because there's no current and there's no circulation. It really is, it's a gravitational model.
Brian?
I'll be very fast because I know we're out of time. Thank you for the talk, by the way. The notion of forms came up a lot in this, and I'm wondering, this might be more of a suggestion than a question, but I'm wondering if you could or have thought about unpacking what you mean by a form on a theoretical level. And I'm thinking about authors like Gurka and Ernst Cassirer, who were associated with notion of metamorphology of forms, how forms change, how knowledge, we can think of knowledge as in terms of forms, which include phenomenological aspects, symbolic aspects, mythological aspects. And a lot of what you spoke about today weaves back and forth between all these categories. And I'm thinking it might be a fruitful literature to draw from, like Ernst Cassirer's philosophy of symbolic forms, as it relates to philosophy of science with myth and symbols. That's a suggestion.
Maybe I'll just take those as a suggestion because I don't know the author, and so that sounds super interesting. And if you saw it weaving in and out of here, then obviously there's some connective tissue there. So I'd love to check that out, and I'd love to think about the difference between form and event, or kind of knowledge forms versus epistemic containers for those knowledge forms. So that's a cool reference.
20th century neo-Kantian author, but
But thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much.